why are all of these cultures like breaking apart? It's because they have equated premarital sexual intercourse as exactly the same moral negative weight as masturbation. And that's really effing stupid. It made a lot of sense before porn existed, because if you look at the lines, and we'll get to in the Bible about this, they don't talk about masturbation, they talk about prostitutes. Seeing a prostitute actually is just as bad or worse than premarital sex. You know, from a disease risk perspective, from a pregnancy risk perspective, there is a reason that historically you needed to warn against all of this stuff, right? But in a modern context, when you put restrictions on porn, you increase the rate of sex crimes.
I'm just saying, what works on planet Galgamech isn't necessarily going to work for the rest of us here on Earth. You see? That's the problem we're having here.
For every 10% of increase in internet access in the US, there is a corresponding regional decrease of 7.3% of grape cases.
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing?
Internet is more porn.
That's gross.
Why you think the net was porn?
UCLA researchers found that sex criminals on average consume less porn than the average person, and started consuming it at a later age than the average non-sex criminal. Within the Czech Republic, where porn was illegal, then legalized, this decriminalization of pornography caused in 1 year grapes to decline by 37% and child sexual abuse by about 50%. Similar results were seen when the porn laws were loosened in Denmark, Japan, China, and Hong Kong.
Wow.
Anyone who is pro pornography restrictions is functionally also pro child grape. The Bible says this best: by their fruits you will know them. How do you know the correct interpretation? It works. If it leads to mass child grape and cover-ups, it's not the correct interpretation. The Bible tells us that. Easy peasy. Right, guys?
I'm just trying to say that if we don't change, then we might lose everyone to atheism.
What exactly do you suggest we change?
Well, for one, no sex with boys.
The holy document of law states that a priest cannot get married, so where are we to get our sex?
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. Today we are going to have a fantastic episode. We are going to go deep into research around sexuality, into statistics around sexuality, into biblical theology. We're going to go into a bunch of lines from the Bible. We're going to go into the philosophy of sexuality. And we are going to be coming up with a model for the way we will teach our kids to engage with their sexuality, because I think one of the biggest back doors, you know, when a person comes to me in a traditional religion, and when they say, you know, when they hear me say, oh, you need to evolve this tradition or you are going to get creamed by the urban monoculture, like, well, what do you mean by that? One of the number one things I am going to elevate is the way that their religion relates to sexuality. Sexual rules that evolved in a time period before basically free internet pornography was everywhere, before contraception, when STDs were running rampant, when you had to worry about getting random people pregnant like at a high level, is going to create a very different optimal rule system than a modern system. And people might be like, well, why not just be stricter? And it's like, well, because that causes really bad externalities within a modern culture, but also leaves often a back door in a child's brain where you have not built a framework for how a part of the world works, that the urban monoculture can basically install a self-replicating mimetic framework that can eventually eat their entire mind. And that's what all the gender ideology stuff is. But first, I want to talk about how these old rules around sexuality keep going wonky in a modern context. And why? As we're going to be arguing here, I would argue that there should be, and I will teach my kids, no cultural restrictions at all around masturbation for pleasure if it is to any image or video that doesn't use a real human. i.e. anything that's AI generated or drawn or anything like that. And we'll get to why, if you make this set of restrictions, it actually solves most of the problems the old restrictions solve, while also protecting against a bunch of the new problems. So problem number one that you see is the Mormon swinger phenomenon. Have you been following these scandals, Simone?
Of course I have. In short, a reality TV show, I think on Hulu, right? Came out detailing moms of TikTok, a TikTok group of Mormon mothers who also just happened to turn out to be swingers.
The point is that this has become common within part of Mormon culture. And specifically what they do is it's not considered cheating if the husband or wife is in the room watching you, which is actually really weird to me because that would cause a really, like, there was a Sneeko drama where like he was in an open relationship and then he talked about watching his girlfriend sleep with another guy. And people were like, that's being cucked. And he's like, no, I'm in an open relationship. And they go, yeah, like open relationships are normal, watching is not. And the reason that other guys would say this, and it appears that just Nico either didn't have this part of his arousal pathway or had this part of his arousal pathway inverted, is a normal male, for obvious evolutionary reasons, is going to get a very strong disgust reaction from watching a partner of his sleeping with another male. That would have been very evolutionarily disadvantageous. Now, for women, it's going to be different because women might have existed in a harem environment or something like that. But for men, this is one of the loudest disgust motivators a normal man can feel. And so I would have to guess that these men might also have had this sort of silenced or muted in them as an arousal pathway. If I was going to guess why this would be uniquely common among Mormons to have the cucking arousal pathway silenced, it might be a holdover from their sister wife ancestors, where the wives who are okay with watching other wives having sex or who got into that might have passed that down to some of their male offspring as well, leading to higher rates of arousal from cuckoldry within the Mormon community. Do you understand the logic behind that, Simone, or do I need to explain it differently? You're giving a face like you didn't understand.
Oh, I'm just thinking about it. I mean, in most of the sister wife arrangements I'm aware of, it's the sex part is not at all shared or communal.
They tell you.
Okay.
No, they obviously wouldn't tell you. Like, I don't even know what you're on about. Like, you think that the sister wives who are trying to show how, and keep in mind, the Mormons who still do this are the most religious of the most religious Mormons. Like, you think that they are really going to tell you, like, the things that are hot about the relationship for them? Come on. Like, you clue in here, Simone. But anyway, I want to be clear here, this is not a Mormon specific problem. Okay. On the Discord, we did a Catholic episode recently, and the first thing everyone was jumping on was like, oh, all those Catholic girls, you know, acting like the butt stuff and the oral isn't going to count when they get to heaven as premarital sexual intercourse.
What's going on?
I don't know. But do you think if I told him I had an incendiary device down my knickers, he'd have a look? Oh, some of them are right. I'm willing to admit it.
Because it is common among Catholic girls. Like, I have slept with girls in this category myself. There is a common thing where it's like, well, oral doesn't really count. And I really like the joke that one of them told us, like, you get to heaven and God's like, I'm sorry, premarital sex, you know, and then the girl's like, wait, play that video back again. Stop, zoom in. See, it was anal. And then God's like, two heavens for you. That there's like these loopholes.
What in God's name are you wearing?
I'm putting together my costume for the Halloween dance. So you're going as a stripper? No, I am a Catholic schoolgirl.
Thank God. Whatever you do, don't slag off the Pope. We're outnumbered.
And again, it's not just the Amish grape epidemic is really bad in the Amish community. Because they're really strict rules. Or, you know, in the modern ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, people are breaking the Shoma Nega. I'm pronouncing it. I'm butchering it. I can't speak other languages. Which are their rules against like hand-holding and touching. Apparently it's really common, but they're supposed to be very, very strictly held. And it's caused by, like, what leads to all of these rules being so feckless? Or other Mormon stuff like soaking, where they just leaves themselves inside the girl, or what's the other one where they like bounce on the bed?
No, that is soaking, where technically, because the male and female partner are not in leading the mechanical effort of thrusting for PIV sex, and instead there is just placement with a very awkward friend theoretically jumping on the bed to assist, that would work out.
Hey,
I still think
high degrees of cuckolding in the Mormon community.
right. That
Maybe
just
Mormons
seems
don't
so
feel as instinct as
apocryphal
much
to me.
as other
It seems
people.
like a joke that somebody made up, and it's really caught on because it's just such a funny concept.
No, I think a lot of this stuff, like the oral and stuff like that, this is actually very common.
No, the oral I know is super like common, where it's like, well, yeah, we don't have sex, but we, oral doesn't count. That I know
oral
for a
and anal
fact
don't
is
count, so
fine. Well, I think anal.
enhance.
I think anal's different. I think anal's different, but I know that oral is a workaround that is definitely.
We're going to talk about why this happens. Why are all of these cultures like breaking apart here? It's because they have equated premarital sexual intercourse for pleasure as exactly the same moral negative weight as masturbation. And that's really effing stupid. It made a lot of sense before porn existed, because if you look at the lines, and we'll get to in the Bible about this, they don't talk about masturbation, they talk about prostitutes. Seeing a prostitute actually is just as bad or worse than premarital sex. From a disease risk perspective, from a pregnancy risk perspective, there is a reason that historically you needed to warn against all of this stuff, right? But in a modern context, if I'm like in absolute terms, if it is a kid who is not allowed to masturbate much more likely to engage in certain types of premarital sex, or engage in, when they're married, certain types of sexual exploration that otherwise they would just feel no desire to do? Absolutely. It is a huge moral failing of the way the rule set is working now. And then there's the secondary problem, which is outright bans on masturbation have a lot of problems. Specifically, if you tell somebody, don't think about X, it causes people to think about X. This has been studied like extremely well. So there is the book on this, if you want to read it, that's pretty good, called Overcoming Unwanted Intrusive Thoughts, a CBT-based guide to getting over frightening, obsessive, or disturbing things. There is also the white bear experiments conducted by Daniel Weger in the 1980s. And these studies asked participants to avoid thinking about a white bear for 5 minutes. And they were very, very bad at it. Specifically, when you ask somebody to not think about something, you are causing them to engage in a form of suppression or psychological suppression, which requires cognitive resources and makes them bad at basically thinking about everything else. And the problem is that some people will be like, oh, but recent research has shown that this doesn't work around things you're afraid of. Okay, yeah, it doesn't have the same effect if you're trying to get rid of like PTSD stuff or things you're afraid of, but it does still hold with sexual things. So here I'm going to read a few other studies. The rebound effect of thought suppression I'm quoting from a study, and this study is called God, I Can't Stop Thinking About Sex, the Rebound Effect in Unsuccessful Suppression of Sexual Thoughts Among Religious Adolescents.
I love when people who do peer-reviewed research do good titles. It's just get to a thing of beauty.
So the rebound effect of thought suppression refers to attempts to suppress thoughts that result in an increase in those thoughts. So in the thoughts that were trying to be suppressed. The aim of this 3-study research was to investigate the suppression of thoughts and its possible importance to cognitive model of predicted compulsive sexual behavior, CSB, among Israeli, Jewish, religious, and secular adolescents. The analysis indicates that religious adolescents are higher in CSB than secular ones, and that religious suppression and CSB mediate the link between religiosity and well-being. So they actually lower the well-being of these students and lower some of the positive effects of religiosity that these students would otherwise be experiencing. And then a 2019 study reported in the Journal of Sex Research, found the attempts to suppress sexual thoughts can result in an increase in those thoughts. This is called the rebound effect. So here I'm going to quote from our book, The Pragmatist's Guide to Sexuality, because we also go into this phenomenon a bit. Some claim that all arousal patterns not tied to penis and vagina sex between a married couple arise when a society loses God. There is an element of truth to this. When surveyed, religious individuals claim to consume porn at lower rates than non-religious individuals, though claimed porn consumption by religious individuals has been increasing rapidly since 1995. This is as far as that element of truth extends, as all other data indicates that these individuals are lying. In fact, when Harvard-educated Microsoft economist Benjamin Edelman investigated porn site subscriptions and Google searches for porn on a regional basis in 2009, he found that the more religious regions consume porn more than the less religious regions, with the highest rates of all being in Utah. Specifically, Edelman found that subscriptions to porn-based sites and online searches for sexual content were higher in states that had enacted laws to defend marriage, and in which statements like, quote, "I never doubt the existence of God," end quote, quote, "even today miracles are performed by the power of God," end quote, quote, "I have old-fashioned values about family and marriage," end quote, and quote, "AIDS might be God's punishment for immoral sexual behavior," end quote, were more prevalent. This finding isn't limited to this one study. A 2015 study, Canadian researcher Kara McGuinness and Gordon Huddleston found that states with a higher percentage of individuals who self-identify as very religious and consider religion to be important to their daily lives have higher rates of searches for sexual content on Google. Studies have shown that people who experience early life stressors and high religiosity may be more likely to exhibit sexually compulsive behaviors. One study found that, quote, "states with more evangelical Protestant theists who profess beliefs in God or higher powers and biblical literalists, those who report that they interpret the Bible as the literal word of God, are significantly more likely to have higher aggregate results of online searches for pornography. States where people attended religious services more frequently were also significantly more likely to have higher rates of searches for online porn. Finally, we find that states with higher percentages of residents unaffiliated with any religious group have significantly lower levels of searching for porn. These findings are interesting because at an individual level, people who affiliate with evangelical Protestant groups, attend church, read the Bible literally, or believe in God generally report much lower levels of pornography consumption," end quote. This quote is from an interview with Andrew L. Whitehead of Clemson University in SciPost. And we also just see this generally in the data. Once during a broadcast of Good Friday Mass from the Vatican, and this was at 2 a.m., the Girls Gone Wild ad accidentally aired, and they received record
Wait,
sales.
accidentally?
Yes, they received record sales for the Girls Gone Wild. That was an old like soft porn thing that existed for people who don't know.
I remember Girls Gone. Yeah, I guess for the younger people.
From a SciPost titled, quote, "A conservative religious environment strongly increases the chance of adolescent porn viewing," study finds, end quote. Quote, "Without controlling for individual religious identity, however, it might be possible that those who have searched for porn in evangelical Protestant states are people who are not evangelical Protestants, but live in predominantly evangelical Protestant states." So they checked. The individual level data from 3,370 youths and their parents allowed researchers to control for age, gender, religious service attendance, importance of religion in life, parental education attainment, and several other religious and demographic factors. Even after accounting for the confounding variables, the researchers found that county-level religious adherence rates still increase the odds of watching porn during adolescence by 66.53%, regardless of religious identity. Similarly, youths were more likely to report viewing porn and continue to do so with a higher share of conservative Protestants, especially among youths who were not conservative Protestants themselves. So a 66.53% interest. That is insanely higher. Like, you are, and here I just note from the Bible, from your fruits you will know them. Is this a good practice? So if I'm making a judgment biblically, I need to say, does it lead to the intended outcome? No, it leads to the opposite outcome. So it is not a good practice. But it gets even worse than that. You are probably hurting kids more than you think by making these requests. specifically here, and if people are like, okay, well, from a religious system, then how do you handle this?
Mhm.
You've got to really worry when you're building your religious system against a phenomenon called scrupulosity. Scrupulosity is the pathological guilt and anxiety about moral issues. Although it can affect non-religious people, it usually just affects religious people. So it's like when you become obsessive compulsive about following a deontological, religious, ethical framework, and it leads to extremely negative life outcomes. So how do you avoid this? How do you avoid this focus on pornography and stuff like that? Well, what you do is elevate the types of thinking you want to elevate rather than suppress the type of thinking you don't want. And we'll get to how you can do that around sexuality at the end of this particular, I guess I'll call these lectures, whatever they are. But Simone, do you want to give your thoughts before I go further?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to discuss this later, but I think that also we're not trying to say shove your kids into erotic material and tell them to have at it and that there are no problems if they start consuming it in excess. Consumption of anything in excess is a sign of a problem, and it's something I think we would discuss with our kids, but within the broader context of excess of anything, where you find that
you might be surprised, but excess porn consumption is incredibly rare outside of religious communities. Porn addiction seems to be specifically related to moral bans on pornography.
Yeah, and that's a sign of a larger problem that appears to need to be solved. But I would just say that I wouldn't even warn our kids about consuming too much. I would warn our kids about anything where you start to change your daily habits and to prioritize consumption of something.
So I would say that I would categorize porn consumption in the same category of immoral action as video games.
Oh, no, I was thinking exactly the same. Video games, food, even exercise. Basically anything where other things in your life are suffering because you are so obsessed with getting in more of an action, and it could be anything, then you have to worry about it. So we don't even have to have that conversation around sexuality. We have that conversation around addiction, period, or habit forming, period.
Mm-hmm. And I will note here, I love when we have takes that are, because I know that this take is going to piss off a lot of our listeners, but it's just so based by the data. Like the data on this particular subject is so overwhelming. And they're like, well, you're not based. And I'm like, well, we're not going along with the urban monoculture's framing on this stuff either, as you'll see. Our in conclusion is quite offensive to them. Being based, it doesn't mean agreeing with everything your group thinks. It means, saying what is true, even when it might lose us subscribers, as this episode probably will. But that's how we keep from getting audience captured. You just got to keep plowing through.
Keep pissing people off. That's the secret.
When the evidence isn't in their favor, and when the biblical text isn't in their favor, as we'll go over, it just very clearly isn't. It's important that we not only do what's best for our kids, but give other people the tools to do what's best for their kids in terms of the way that they teach them about this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm going to be quoting from the Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality again. Masturbation may contribute to a decline in many social ills. UCLA researchers found that sex criminals, on average, consume less porn than the average person, and started consuming it at a later age than the average non-sex criminal. Had today's sex criminals been able to explore their sexuality through their imagination earlier, perhaps they would not have felt compelled to commit their sex crimes later. So I should note here, when you put restrictions on porn, you increase the rate of sex crimes. In fact, the data bears this out. For every 10% of increase in internet access in the US, there is a corresponding regional decrease of 7.3% of grape cases, suggesting that the internet and its facilitation of masturbation may provide an outlet for sexual energy that might otherwise cause serious damage. Across nations, more permissive attitudes towards pornography are correlated with lower rates of rape and less violence against women. A great study of this can be seen within the Czech Republic, where porn was illegal under communism, then legalized when the party fell. This decriminalization of pornography caused, in 1 year, rapes to decline by 37%, and child sexual abuse by about 50%. Similar results were seen when the porn laws were loosened in Denmark, Japan, China, and Hong Kong.
Wow.
Anyone who is pro pornography restrictions is functionally also pro-child rape, period. We have seen this happen multiple times. When you implement those laws, the result is children getting raped.
I forgot just how striking the data was. It's insane that people are still, that there's any ambiguity here. It just seems so
no
obvious.
ambiguity at all. I mean, regardless, if a person wants to at an individual level say they believe in restricting access for them or their kids to pornography, I'm like, okay, I can get behind that. But when somebody begins to push laws around this at the state level, they are now, in my mind, around the same category of morality as a child trafficker, because they just, or somebody who facilitates laws that facilitate that, because they just show that they do not care about the actual results of what they're doing, and they do not care about the actual children who are going to suffer because of the choices that they are making for essentially virtue signals. And we've seen this within some conservative events in the UK, and it's like the one thing where I just want to like, oh my God, or even that when Project 2025 suggested pornography bans in the United States, I just wanted to slap the person who wrote that. I was like, do you understand the consequences of the laws that you are suggesting be put into place? But they don't care. They don't care. These virtue signalers do not care. Everything for them is this bizarre virtue spiral.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it as not caring. I would put it as not thinking about it and not orienting around truth or evidence-based decisions, because humans aren't. Now, there's a portion of us of ourselves, I would say our prefrontal cortex, which is all about evidence-based decisions, but that thing came last, and that thing comes online fully last, and most of us barely get out of like our limbic system. So can you blame us? We have the potential, but it's not the default. So I don't blame people for virtue spiraling and focusing on social conformity.
I do. You say you don't blame people, but the result, you've always said things happening to kids is your line.
Yeah, no, that's my line. Well, and also I see the only thing that makes us human as our prefrontal cortex. So at the same time, I don't blame them, but I also dehumanize them because I think that they're reverting to that which is less human. But I still understand. I guess I should reword it to, I understand why they do that. They are failing to rise above, but they are doing what the default is. So,
well, they're acting like animals, and
yes.
I believe people who act like animals should be treated like animals.
Well,
and thought of as animals, because they are not rising above their animalistic instincts to think through and look through what are the results of the stuff that they're proposing. And I think people often are surprised, like, why are we so viscerally against porn bans? And that is why, because of the consequence.
Well, which is kind of ironic, because what people think of when they think about indulging in porn is people succumbing to their animalistic instincts. And indeed, that is a part of it. But it's more like acknowledging that there presently is not a convenient way around these animalistic instincts, at least for some people of certain hormonal profiles. And of course, there are things you can do that can suppress that, but they have side effects that can be dangerous. So if we have to live with these instincts, the better thing to do is to grab control of them and exercise them in ways that are minimally damaging, which per our policy around erotic material, no human actors, and in moderation, it is 100% the most optimal way to deal with these urges. It makes perfect
without
sense.
any of the negative externalities.
Exactly.
When you remove human actors, then you remove any trafficking problems, you remove any problems with prostitution, you remove any problems with impressed labor, you remove any problems, like you remove pretty much all of the moral qualms.
Yeah. So when I model the argument of someone who's opposing us, what they're trying to say is, oh, you say we're supposed to rise above with evidence-based thought, but we're trying to rise above our basest human instincts by simply abstaining from all of it altogether. But what we're saying is you can't do that.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah, it clearly doesn't work. And when you try to do that, it backfires. So what we need to do is acknowledge where our limits are, prepare for our limits, build around the limits, and then rise above in more meaningful ways until we can fully extinguish this. And we've in other podcasts even talked about how when it gets to be possible to safely suppress human sexual instincts, we will 100% do so. And already all of our kids have even been created in the complete absence of actual sexual intercourse. I mean, like, we have sex, but our kids are not created using sex because we feel that there are better ways to do that.
Well, Simone, there are ways to already mute sexual impulses. You can
Well, no,
use
there
like-
are. It's just that the side effects, like, for example, me starving myself as a teen 100% worked because it just took my entire hormonal system offline. And then I had the hormonal profile of a prepubescent child, essentially. So there are ways to do it. I just think the side effects are damaging. And also, like, you can go on, you can delay, you can go on gender affirming care and delay
But
onset
Simone,
of
why are
puberty.
you ignoring naltrexone? It obviously works. It has almost no side effects.
But would naltrexone
Look, I am
stop
not for
arousal?
the government mandating naltrexone, but what I am saying is technology already exists.
But naltrexone, that deals with addiction pathways, not with
No,
arousal.
it can vary. If I was to masturbate while on naltrexone for like 3 days in a row, I would stop wanting to masturbate.
Would you stop having interest in?
Yes. I'd stop having interest in women. Yes. That's the way naltrexone works. It works on your opioid pathways and removes
arousal is just 100% on that system, you're saying?
100% on that system.
Oh, okay. Okay, fair point then.
So we already have tools for doing this, but do I think it's ethical to mandate everyone take something like this or even pressure our kids to take it? No, I would say it's an option if they think it's the best way to control a certain impulse. But no, I'm very against mandating any of this stuff. All right, now back to what I'm reading here.
Okay.
Other studies reinforce these results, such as one in aggression and violent behavior that found a weak inverse correlation between porn consumption and violent behavior towards women, specifically rape and sexual assault. The study's findings suggest that the more porn a man consumes, the less likely he is to commit these violent acts against women. Despite what we had assumed, masturbation and porn consumption do not lead people to think less of women. People who watch pornography hold views of women as more equal to men than those who do not watch pornography. Consumers of porn are no less likely to describe themselves as feminists and actually express more egalitarian ideas about both women in positions of power and working outside the home, according to results of a study published in the Journal of Sex Research. We did, however, find a study showing that men who were low on the trait of agreeableness did increase already existing sexist attitudes when exposed to pornography. So basically, you need to get incredibly in the weeds to show when you have these individuals like Louise Perry, who I love, but I think she has some stuff like porn causes men to think poorly of women or like do these derogatory sex acts towards women. And it's like, that is factually untrue. And I will never get over these women today, because I hear this in conservative spaces. They're like, men choke women during sex because of porn, and then women learn to like it because of that. And I'm like, we did not make you all turn 50 Shades of Grey into a best-selling book. That stuff is coming from women. As a guy who has slept around a lot, that stuff is coming from women. Okay? That's not coming from the male side of the sexuality spectrum, and you can see this in our data. It is the women who aren't consuming as much of the traditional pornography who are more desiring of the violent category of sexuality. You are just denying their experiences and likely haven't felt them, because it appears, and people can watch our other videos on it, that form of female sexuality might be triggered by a high body count, but I don't want to get into that. If you want to get into that, you can go to our video on, what's a good one on this? I believe it's like Raider versus Homesteader sexuality. I'll try to quickly and briefly explain how the theory works here. So essentially, we argue that in a historic context, women could have found themselves in multiple scenarios for which a different arousal profile would have been optimal. Specifically, they could have found themselves in a monogamous cultural group, they could have found themselves in a polygynous cultural group, or they could have found themselves as essentially a slave taken during a raid or a war or something like that. We argue that women evolved a changing arousal pattern based on specific environmental conditions, and that we can actually see this in the data and know what those conditions are. Specifically, when a woman hasn't slept with a lot of people, she will have a release of oxytocin during intercourse, which causes a involuntary, you could almost argue, bonding with the person she is sleeping with, i.e., she is very likely to fall in love with that person just because of the act of sex, and that sex modulates and makes it much faster that she forms a love bond with an individual, but that this no longer happens the more partners she has. And we can see this from a lowering of oxytocin during sex when women have had lots of different partners. And this is because in an evolutionary context, that would have only happened in a polygynous society. In a monogamous society, it is very advantageous for a woman to fall in love with and build an emotional bond with the individual she is sleeping with. But in a society where she is sleeping with a large number of men, this is not advantageous. And if you're talking about a very large number of partners, that would only happen if she was a slave. Now, in that latter case, we actually see, and this is backed up by data that Ayla collected, that women who have lots and lots of partners actually get turned on by violence much more than women who have had few partners. And that this would make sense if this hypothesis that we have is true. And so when these women say, I can't imagine any woman being turned on by this, and they are a low partner count woman, it's like, well, that's in part because you are a low partner count woman that you can't imagine that. But it's leading you to misdiagnose where these things are entering our culture from. It is not from men, it is from women. And through that misdiagnosis and putting the blame on pornography, you put children at risk. All right. Now back to reading. We did recall reading about a study conducted by the Max Planck Institute showing that intense porn consumption in men was associated with lower gray matter volume in the brain. So we went back to the study only to realize that what it actually found was that men who consumed lots of porn had lower amounts of gray matter in a specific part of the brain, the right striatum. The problem is that this part of the brain is also involved in reward processing. All the study says is that men who have deficient reward processing pathways consume more porn.
And this is very similar to people who are overly addicted to social media or video games, and all you have to do at that point is, don't they call it dopamine fasting, where you just sort of stop it for 30 days?
No, the point I'm putting is if you have a broken reward pathway, it's very likely that you're going to become addicted to behavior patterns that are meant to satisfy that reward pathway. This doesn't show causality, it shows causation. It shows people born with a broken reward pathway follow that reward pathway in a broken fashion.
What I read from that, are you sure? Because what I read from that was it indicated that maybe they'd been overexposed to the point of numbness because they...
No, it didn't match. So you're assuming that what it's showing is that when men consumed more porn, their gray matter decreased, which isn't what it showed. It showed when their gray matter decreased, they consumed more porn. And in exactly the part of the brain you would expect this to happen.
Interesting. Okay.
But there's actually data that this isn't correlational, because we're going to get further here. A study conducted on college students found that those who masturbated more actually had more sex than those who masturbated less. Another study found that people who masturbate more often have happier marriages and more satisfying sex within those marriages. Masturbating while fantasizing about one's partner has also been shown to improve the quality of relationships and reduce relationship damaging behavioral patterns. Studies have even shown that the concept of building up tolerance to vanilla porn, suggesting that that is why some people go into increasingly weird porn, is false. And this is something we were formerly certain was true. So we are quite excited to learn that we were wrong. Specifically, people who like weird porn still get turned on by vanilla porn at an even higher level than people who prefer vanilla porn. Statistically speaking, of course, this isn't true for every single individual. Essentially, escalating weirdness in porn taste may be a product of a higher affinity for porn in general. The underlying arousal patterns experienced by weird porn aficionados don't shift in response to exposure to weird porn. They merely are able to tolerate more obscure content. We do not start to see any consistent negative effects from masturbation and porn consumption until we get to studies looking at masturbation 3 or more times a day, and even those seem a little cherry-picked. One study found that pornography negatively affects working memory, though the effect holds only while one is watching it. Thanks, Captain Obvious. We'll be sure to remember that the next time we decide to take a test while masturbating. We also found some studies showing that when a woman knows her boyfriend is masturbating, it can hurt her body image. And some studies indicate that poor masturbation technique in men gripping too hard can lower a man's sensitivity. Still, none of this really seems to paint even fairly frequent masturbation as being bad on the whole. And the thing that gets me is just like everything they're saying, like, oh, if you masturbate, you'll be worse in bed. It's like, well, factually, that's untrue. People who masturbate more are rated as
Well,
better.
it's also like saying, well, if you run poorly, you know, and you have bad running shoes, then your ankles will become injured chronically. And it's like, well, yeah, true. Technique is important with anything, and moderation is important with anything. And I think the whole female body image thing has more to do with culture and quite frankly, the toxic culture and discussion around porn that makes women feel bad about it. And this is somewhere else in the Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, but the data that we found when doing research for the book also found that women who consume porn tend to be more sexually comfortable and enjoy sex more. So in general, as a female, even getting into porn seems to just be purely additive to your sex life and your confidence, which is, I mean, it makes sense when you actually look at porn that's designed around women, but I think given the toxic discourse around porn as it stands, yeah, it makes sense why.
Yeah. Well, and this is unfortunately being perpetuated by some of our friends, which is very frustrating to me that they don't just look at the research, you know?
Well, it could also just be an audience capture thing, because when we went, for example, to the ARC conference in London last year, which was supposed to be like the conservative Davos, that subject came up so much and it was such a crowd pleaser that it was hard. I mean, it would be really difficult for these people who are trying to rise as conservative thought leaders, especially in the United Kingdom and Europe, which has that sort of curmudgeonly form of defeatist form of conservatism, that you can't take the other stance because you would be shadow banned from those communities. You would not be invited to speak. They don't have a choice.
Well, thank God we're not there. They're all going to die out anyway. I really care very little about them because they're so obviously going to die out. They don't have the fighting spirit to get through for the Valley of the Lotus Eaters. Well, it's true. These people who are up there whinging about banning porn have like no kids. Like, I'm like, okay, clearly you don't like have good solutions to this, do you? Anyway. All right. Okay. But what about addiction? Masturbation addiction is destroying the lives of millions of young Americans, right? The answer here is a resounding anecdotally. Masturbation is not recognized as addictive by the American Psychological Association, APA, and was not categorized as a mental health condition in the latest standard diagnostic manual, DSM-5. We readily admit that this seems a little weird that there isn't much research showing masturbation can be addictive, as it seems to affect opioid pathways, i.e., the naltrexone thing. And most things that affect opioid pathways enhance one's ability to learn a behavior and thus cause addiction in a subset of the population. Think gambling, alcohol, morphine, etc. Because porn affects opioid pathways, it causes the parts of the brain to light up when exposed to opioids. So people often be like, do you know that porn also affects the parts of the brain that are affected by, like opioid addictions, right? It's like, well, yeah, that's because it affects opioid pathways. That doesn't mean, this also does that for me, okay? A lot of things we do on a daily basis. The question is are you susceptible to addictions to that particular chain of opioid pathways? And it appears that masturbation addictions outside of individuals who are banning masturbation, which means it's likely something other than a standard addiction. So if you don't have a religious thing against it, are astronomically rare. It seems that your brain essentially down-regulates a desire to masturbate if you are doing it 2 or more times a day. But anyway, back to the topic here. Instead of being thought of as an addiction, the current consensus seems to be that frequent masturbation should be categorized as a compulsion. This is the same categorization given to what is colloquially called a quote-unquote sex addiction. In this case, there doesn't seem to be anything, neurologically speaking at least, that differentiates someone who has a quote-unquote addiction to masturbation versus sex, meaning the negative effects resulting from masturbation too much would arise after too much sex. Even then, calling masturbation addiction seems tenuous. For more on this, read The Myths of Sex Addiction by David Lee, PhD. Now, it gets worse than all of this. Like when you're talking about the benefits of masturbation, there's a great paper, The Role of Masturbation in Healthy Sexual Development, Perceptions of Young Adults. This came out in 2011 and showed that frequent masturbation was associated with higher educational outcomes. So you get more sex, you get higher educational outcomes, you get, well, I can go through other things. It has been shown to improve sleep quality. It has been shown to reduce the probability of prostate cancer. It has been shown to relieve menstrual cramps. It has been shown to reduce the risk of urinary tract infections. It has been shown to reduce muscle tension. It has been shown to improve the immune system.
Well, I think I highly associate it with vitalism too, in general. Like if someone, and you see this in characters in history like King Henry VIII and Winston Churchill. These are people who were voracious on all fronts, right? Heavy drinkers, heavy eaters, heavy sportsmen, heavy romantically, right? That just on everything. And I think that there's something to do with leaning into everything and going all in and being very passionate, and that being associated with high achievement. Like intuitively and culturally, it makes sense. Whereas being someone who abstains, I mean, it's a very Buddhist thing, you know, this discipline, this stepping back, but that also doesn't correlate with achievement, you know? It correlates, I guess, with virtue from that perspective of a monk, but monks are not really famous for changing the course of history. I mean, even the Dalai Lama, we all love him, but he's not.
Yeah, well, and I would say that it's when people are like do No Nut November or something and like note benefits from it, the key benefit they're getting is from denying an impulse. But there are other impulses you could deny that aren't going to cause intrusive thoughts other than masturbation. That's the problem. It's not that you're not going to get benefits. Like all people get benefits from denying impulses.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there was some famous, maybe he was a physicist or a researcher or something like that. There was this amazing quote from him because some friend bet him that like he was too addicted to some form of amphetamines to even stop them for a month. And he did, and he had no problem. He was fully able to do it. And he's like, and you set back my field significantly for a month. You know, like the world is at a loss because I stopped doing this just to do it.
Yeah.
The act of trying not to think about sex, the act of trying to quit coffee, the act of trying to hold yourself back and all of these things takes so much time and effort. And for what?
Yeah. Okay. So now an individual might be like, okay, well, it might be good for your physical state, but it's not good for your mental state. Well, here's the problem. With regards to benefits to one's mental state, masturbation has been shown to release sexual tension, reduce stress, improve self-esteem, improve body image, and lead to higher self-reported rates of happiness. Some studies have shown this may not be the case in adolescent women, but lateral longitudinal studies suggest this was due to confounding factors. So, like, it's just like a strict negative thing to be against. Like, now this wasn't true historically. When you didn't have modern pornography, like before you had AI and drawn pornography and stuff like that, and you had to rely on the porn industry that used real people.
That's the thing though, is that honestly was a pretty short-lived thing. So from this, like when the first photographs were made until maybe 5-10 years ago, yes, there was this weird short period where photos and video of sexual acts was pervasive. But before that, there was so much drawn porn. It was all drawn porn. You see it going back forever and ever and ever.
Well, by the way, people who think that like Rule 64 porn, like drawn cartoon characters in porn stuff is new, they were in Tilly and MacBooks in the 1920s. If you go back before that, you will see drawn characters of gods and stuff like that, clearly in pornographic positions. Fictional characters.
Oh, and they were referred to as like political cartoons, but think about all of the sexualized cartoons of Marie Antoinette and other historical figures. This was just pervasive. It's fine. It's what we do.
I wonder why people sexualize these sorts of characters. It's likely because we have a system that increases our arousal pathway to any character we have a parasocial or social connection to, and many people build social connections to characters that they hear about or see a lot,
Yeah.
more so than a random person who might be appearing in a porn video. Now, also, we've got to talk about just how negative sex was in a historic context. That you could accidentally get somebody pregnant.
Oh gosh. Well, and
Like going out
syphilis.
to
Let's
hire
not
help.
forget about syphilis.
Or syphilis that would drive you crazy, or that there were giant gangs of orphans from this in places like London, or
Yeah.
that they would randomly leave. You can close your ears, Simone.
Okay, wave your hands when you're done.
Okay, there are reports of people stepping over babies being very common, dead babies in London during this period, because it was just so common to have children out of wedlock and leave them for exposure. Extramarital and premarital sex was genuinely horrific in a pre-modern context, but we are not in a pre-modern context, and our children are being lost in droves. All right, you can come back. You can come back.
Okay.
Like,
Thanks.
this wouldn't be a thing that I'd be going on about if it had no negative consequences, if it didn't lead to the
Bad things.
bad things I mentioned before that I don't
That
want
we do not talk about around Simone because Simone can't afford to cry all night. Thank you.
But
I mean, also like women, even sex within marriage was a pretty big risk because the number of times you could expect a friend or family member to die in childbirth was.
Oh yeah, and women, I don't know if you know, they lost a tooth on average with every pregnancy.
Pregnancies were rough on women, but also just this idea of, well, maybe I'll die, maybe I'll get a baby. I don't know, worth it. Let's give this a roll of the dice. It was dangerous, even in the best of contexts. You have all the resources, you have the best medical care. You might still die. So
that is not the context we need to motivate sex in today.
Very different context today.
Totally different. Yeah. So now we're going to go into Bible stuff for people who are like, but somebody who hadn't read the Bible told me the Bible said, and I'm like, well, let's go into what the Bible does say, okay?
Let's do it.
Because
Okay.
I know that a lot of the things that people think are in the Bible just aren't, and it always surprises me. So we're going to go into all the times the Bible might be talking about masturbation. Genesis 38, 9 through 10. The story of Onan is sometimes associated with masturbation because Onan, quote, spilled the seed on the ground, end quote, to avoid providing an heir for his deceased brother, which God condemned. However,
it seems like that was the dick move. It wasn't the masturbation.
Was about not providing an heir for his brother. It was not about the masturbation. So for people who don't know this was a very important rule in Jewish traditions, which is that if a wife's husband died, she was supposed to marry his brother. This makes a lot of sense from a genetics perspective. It's actually like a very fair thing. It is something I would want to happen to my wife if I died before our first kid was born. Because if she inherited all of my money, who do I want that money going to but a close genetic relative to me? Who is a good close genetic relative to me? Well, my brother's kid it might not be 50% me, but it's 25% me. Like, that's a really sensible law. To decide not to do that, that is a move in the extreme, and God was right to condemn him. But that has nothing to do with masturbation, okay? That has to do with masturbating and then not putting it in the woman. If he had taken that and then put it in the woman, God would have been chill. That's like, he didn't even need to have PIV.
Well, or if he had done that, but then the next day had sex and produced the heir, then it also would have been. It seems like the act of sticking it to his brother was the problem.
So now we're going to deal with Matthew 5, 27 through 30. And so for people who understand the context of this is when Jesus goes through a bunch of old commandments and then just updates them to be like more extreme. Basically, in this section, he is emphasizing how easy it is to sin by listing examples that show that people were too strict about putting sin into categories where, well, only when you do this big thing are you actually sinning, not when you do this little thing are you actually sinning. Here, I'll give you some examples. In this category, he says, "You have heard it said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who said to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable in court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell." So here he is saying, if you have ever called someone a fool, that is in a way equivalent to murdering someone. And I agree with this. It is sinful to be derogatory of other people, but it is also something that we all do. The point being made here is that everybody lives a life of sin. For example, in another category here, he says, again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not break your oaths, but fulfill the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need is to say simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. So again, here he's saying that like it is a sin to make promises to other people, to swear to other people, to even sign a contract with Apple when you're using Apple Store. All you're allowed to say is yes or no. That is the only way you can prevent yourself from sinning. There is also a part here where he says, and if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat to them as well. So again, he's saying here, well, it would be a sin if somebody decides to unrightly, here, this is right after the, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, then turn the other cheek also. So he's saying, when somebody attacks you or is unjust towards you, gives them the thing that they're asking of you, and to not do that is a sin. So if anyone has ever accused you of something or sued you of something, you are supposed to immediately capitulate the lawsuit and give more to them than whatever they were asking for. Not doing that is the same category as lusting over someone who's not your wife. Lusting over someone who's not your wife within this part of Matthew here is in the same category of sin as signing a Apple user agreement. It's in the same category of sin of calling someone else a fool. It is absolutely a sin. See track 8, anything that's not done for the glory of God is a sin. That's made very clear in the Bible. But it is of the same category of sin where we're just supposed to remember that it is impossible to live a life without sin and to strive to be a good person in spite of that. It is not of the same category of sin of murder or something. And this is incredibly clear when you're reading this section of Matthew, to the point where I would say anyone who is using this line to argue something else was meant by this, and like not putting it in the context of this is also the part where you're never supposed to make any oath or promise to someone other than saying yes or no. This is the part where you are supposed to never call someone a fool, where you're never supposed to get angry with your brother or sister, where you're supposed to immediately capitulate any suit brought against you and give the person more than what they're asking for. And they're not including that when they're like, oh, he said, don't lust after anyone who's not your wife, that they're being intentionally dishonest with you. They are intentionally using the Bible in an attempt to manipulate you by presenting something out of context and hoping that you are, too dumb to go look up where this is said in the Bible. And I would then put that next to all of the other stuff they're teaching you about the Bible. All of the other stuff they're saying, well, the Bible says this or the Bible says this. Because if they were willing to use the Bible to mislead you in this area, where else are they willing to use the Bible to mislead you?
You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery within his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And for your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for you to throw the whole thing in hell. So do you really think Jesus means for you to rip out your eyeball because you accidentally looked at a woman with lust? No, do you really believe that's the rule being set in place here?
No, it sounds like he's clearly trying to point out that humans are wretched, flawed, sinful beings, and that to try to be perfect is kind of ridiculous, right? Isn't that what he's saying?
Trying to show you the ridiculousness of trying to follow these rules in that way. If you don't believe that that's what's being said here, if you believe Jesus is actually commanding you to rip out your eyeball, if you have ever looked at a woman lustfully, go ahead. Right? Take out those eyes, put them on the table. Because I know you have. I know everyone has. Jesus knows you have. Don't be an effing moron in the way you read things to argue for some deontological approach that was clearly not meant in the original text. Jesus did not actually want every man who had ever looked at a woman lustfully to rip out their eyes. Okay? And I would note here that even with this framing, we are still not saying that people should break it. Because we are not saying look at a woman lustfully. We are limiting guilt-free masturbation to only AI and drawn stuff. So you're not looking at a woman lustfully, so it doesn't break the rules.
Yeah. Well, and also that it just, especially these days, it's more dangerous than ever to be involved or get into, we'll say, live action erotic material, because that's more moving in the direction of OnlyFans and other sites that have you interacting directly with a live person and developing a parasocial relationship. And that actually becomes quite a very real financial relationship in which you are undergoing a huge opportunity cost to invest in what starts out as basically porn consumption and masturbation, and then becomes a relationship in which you are being basically a sugar daddy to someone else, and also getting this feeling like you are getting a girlfriend experience and being in a relationship when you're not. So you are just throwing away your mental processing power for a relationship.
You're making now. There's like, that's part of why we have this additional restriction. No real girls. So you don't form these. Okay.
Yeah.
Leviticus 16, quote, when a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water, and he will be unclean till evening. And any clothing or leather that his semen is on must be washed with water, and it will be unclean till evening. When a man has sexual relations with a woman and there is an emission of semen, both of them must bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. So what is this saying? That a man having an emission, because it's categorizing two different instances here. One in which a man has an emission of semen, one in which a man has an emission of semen with a woman. And they are both categorized as the same type of uncleanliness. So it is saying that masturbating as just an unclean an act as sleeping with your wife. Now, if you read earlier in this same chapter, it talks about an additional level of uncleanliness. This is someone you shouldn't touch, you shouldn't interact with. These are people who have blocked their emissions. Now, I will note that this could be read as a disease because it talks about unusual emissions or blocked emissions, but you could read this as saying that blocking emissions, i.e. not regularly masturbating as a young man, makes you more unclean than regular sex or masturbation, and makes you the type of person people probably shouldn't be interacting with, which I agree with. Leviticus, way to go. Now let's go with Corinthians 6:18. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body, end quote, people will say. Except it is very clear in context that this is not talking about all forms of sexual impropriety, but prostitution specifically, as it comes immediately after the line, quote, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself? Shall I take the members of Christ and unite them with a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her body? For it is said, the two will become one flesh, but whoever is united with the Lord will be one with him in spirit. And yes, prostitutes are a unique form of sin, especially in ancient times, because you risk getting them pregnant and creating an unwanted child. Quote, do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ himself, end quote, except your body is not Christ's body. So what is this talking about here? This is talking about the intergenerational concept of martyrdom, in which case, yes, you are literally Christ's body. But also consider the line, do you not know that he who unites himself with a prostitute is one with her body? For it is said that the two will become one flesh, but whoever is united with the Lord is one with him in spirit. Except you are not one body with a prostitute when you have sex with her. That's a ridiculous thing. You don't become one body with someone if you, at what point are you one body? When your penis goes in her? When you're, obviously not. However, you do become one body with her and one soul with her if you create a child with her.
This isn't warning against sexual immorality from the perspective of sexual release. It's warning against sexual immorality where you become one body and one soul with somebody else, i.e., create a new human being. The Bible isn't stupid, okay? The Bible would be stupid if it thought two people became one person when they were having sex, because that obviously doesn't happen. But it obviously does happen that two people having sex have the potential to create one new unified whole. Finally, a note on killing through masturbation that I want to go through here, because so when somebody says to me that an embryo is a human life, they often leave out one little caveat here. They go, an embryo is a human life when you put it in a woman's womb. And it's like, well, yes, that's true. And then they're like, well, sperm and eggs aren't really a human life yet. And it's like, well, I mean, but they are when you put them in a woman's womb, right? So the asset that turns things into life, that creates human life, is the woman's womb, right? You're playing a little trick. So either you have to admit that both sperm and egg are equally as human as an embryo, because they both become humans when you put them in a human's womb. Or you have to admit that they both fall into a secondary category of things that might become human if put in a woman's womb. Well, here is where this becomes a problem with arguments against things like IVF. If I turn the sperm that my body might produce and the eggs your body might produce, and I create embryos for them, which are now in the same category as sperm versus eggs in Catholic world, because they're saying, no, okay, I'll categorize these things as the same thing. Well, I can create more children per emission than they can. I could masturbate once, and then that single masturbation can become 20, 30 kids, you know, when you're using IVF, right? And so they would have a moral mandate if they actually believed this to only use IVF. But of course, they don't really believe that. They don't really believe they're killing millions of humans every time they masturbate. So if this line of argument was a little difficult for you to follow, I will use different words to explain it. Essentially, what I'm doing is I'm explaining a third hypothetical position that an individual might take. An individual might say that it is immoral to masturbate because you are producing semen, which might one day become a human being. In the same way, an embryo might one day become a human being if it was placed within a woman's womb. So the first part of the argument here is I was actually arguing for their position. I was saying if you argue that anything that might become a human being when put in a woman's womb should be treated as murdering a human being, i.e., some individuals are like, well, an embryo could eventually become a human being if put in a woman's womb, therefore we should be treating it as if terminating an embryo is the same as terminating a living, thinking fetus. Then you are forced into the ethical position that both sperms and eggs, because they also, like an embryo, become a living, thinking fetus when put in a woman's womb, are things of value equivalent of a fetus's or adult human's life, or maybe like half that value or something. I don't know however you're doing the equation, but however you do the equation, you're still like half murdering someone. Well, if you believe that, then you sort of end up getting forced to use IVF, because it means when you're having PIV intercourse, there are millions of individual sperms dying, which you could prevent through just masturbating once, collecting your semen, using it to fertilize a series of embryos, implanting those embryos, and then never masturbating again in your life. Now, this seems really silly to me, which we'll get to why in just a second, but that is the position you are forced into. So to take me, if I do IVF every time my wife can do a cycle over a period of, say, 10 years, I will have 8 kids. That's 8 lives I created because I used the resources God gave me to carry out his command, which was to be fruitful and multiply. And said, well, okay, I know you gave me a miracle that allowed me to have more surviving children, but I'm going to turn that down. I am fully responsible for those children who didn't get to come to exist. Word this a bit differently. The actual asset which determines how many humans come into the world is not the sperm and the eggs.
it is the woman's uterus. If you use that uterus in a way that is inefficient, you prevent humans, souls, if you believe in them, from entering this world that otherwise would have been here. So, for example, if I inefficiently am just dead fast on not using IVF, my wife is very likely to get pregnant much fewer times than she would get pregnant if we are using IVF, because IVF allows you to have healthy pregnancies much, much later. Now, I would note, IVF allows you to have healthy pregnancies much later if the embryos were created when both of you were young, as we did with our embryos. Because of this, I'm likely going to be able to have probably around double the number of kids I would have been able to have if I was only having regular PIV sex. Now, for us, it's different because she can only have children with IVF, but I'm just saying hypothetically if this wasn't the case. If we tried to sort of max the number of kids we were having within her fertility window, we might end up having 4 or 5 kids. If, on the other hand, I'm using IVF, we end up having 10 kids. Well, the problem is by making the indulgent choice to only create children through PIV intercourse, I have chosen a timeline in which those additional 5 humans never come to exist. Those additional fetuses, those additional children, the lives that they live never come to exist. And we would argue that you are morally responsible for this indulgence. You don't get to shirk off the moral responsibility for it. Now, you might say you cannot bear moral responsibility for a human that doesn't exist yet, because they have no moral weight yet. However, Jeremiah 1:5 says that God knew us before we were in our mother's womb, which shows that that's the way that God looks at these moral calculations, that we exist before we are in our mother's womb. We exist at the point that there is a potentiality that we could come to exist. So there were those who would argue that when we say something like, in our framing of sexuality or when life begins, that we are moving in the direction of the urban monoculture and away from strict interpretations of the Bible, when actually the opposite is true. We are trying to move for a stricter interpretation of the Bible, which instead of moving away from the quote-unquote conservative traditionalist Christian standpoint towards the urban monoculture, is going in a completely orthogonal or maybe even opposite direction, in that what we believe is required of a person is actually much, much stricter than what they would think is required of an individual. These interpretations around when life begins are much more onerous in terms of the sacrifices you have to make as an individual than the old interpretations. They are just also efficacious and in line with what's actually in the Bible. And I think that that's also really important here, is that it matters that nowhere in the Bible does it say that you shouldn't masturbate. And in fact, there are several lines that would make it seem that it's actually quite bad to not masturbate. For example, the line about individuals with blocked emissions being extra, extra, extra unclean, and the line that says that a man issuing an emission without a woman around is of the same moral weight as him issuing an emission with his wife. That to me seems pretty clearly to state that these things are of the same moral weight. And so if God wanted strict rules around this stuff, why didn't he ever mention it anywhere in the Bible? Anywhere in the Bible. And then you have to say, oh, well, maybe somebody else wanted strict rules around this stuff. And it's like, aha, yes, because it used to be important to have strict rules around this stuff when you're dealing with like medieval prostitutes and stuff. But that is not the world we live in today. And by the way, that stuff was warned about in the Bible. When you demarcate masturbation as having the exact same negative moral weight as sleeping with a prostitute or premarital sex, you create a scenario in which when a young person is like, well, I'm going to break the rules anyway, they end up breaking them in horrifyingly more dangerous ways than they otherwise might. And so we instead would advocate for kids, for our offspring, to focus their useful sexual energy on something that is not going to accidentally get somebody pregnant or accidentally put them in a dangerous legal situation or lead them to making very bad decisions around who they marry, i.e. marrying somebody because they think they're hot.
So the final rules around masturbation is masturbation to generate pleasure in human using human simulacrums like drawn things and stuff like that. That's okay. Images, books, text chats, etc. But real women should be avoided. Premarital or extramarital sex should only be had for reasons benefiting one's objective function and never for pleasure as the primary motivation. So that's where we are much stricter on sexuality than traditional Christian frameworks, which is to say that you can have sex, but you need to be having it for a reason other than just pleasure. Now, that reason can be bonding with your spouse, or that reason be something more Machiavellian, but it has to be for a reason. Sex for pleasure is sinful, but you have this additional access category. Now, this creates a lot of positive externalities. It releases the moral negative externalities of prostitution. It releases the probability that somebody will try to control you through sexuality. All right, Simone, so we didn't really get a chance to discuss the long-term consequences of these new rules at the end of this, but this new framing, I think, is really important for modern technological context, so I want to explain it more.
Okay.
Why? Because a lot of people could see this as a loosening of restrictions, but it's actually a strengthening of a specific set of restrictions while loosening another set of restrictions to make that strengthening realistic. Specifically, we are strengthening the restrictions on never having sex purely for pleasure.
Yeah.
And somebody could be like, what's the advantage of that? And how does this other system help? Why is it okay to saturate, like, why is it okay to say all the porn you want so long as it's not using real people? Well, one, you do not appear to be able to turn off anyone's like instinctual desires. So for example, if I am same-sex attracted, there is nothing that appears to be able to lessen that except for one thing. Do you remember what that one thing is, Simone?
Oversaturation.
Oversaturation. So if I am same-sex attracted, I should be able to happily live a life with an opposite gender individual if I can masturbate all the time, if I can textualize the point of the marriage as not being about who I marry, like the sex, right? Like they could be gay as well, or they could be, but the kids themselves. And somebody can be like, that's horrifying. It's horrifying from the perspective of the urban monoculture. Because if you are a parent like with kids, if somebody asks you, and I guarantee every parent here could say this, okay, you get a choice. You either never get to have sex again, or we take away your kids.
Oh.
No one.
Yeah.
No one is going to settle for sex.
Yeah. Actually, well, don't say no one. People are very disappointing.
Some weird psychopaths. But what I'm saying is like, largely speaking, you realize is the sexual part of your life is just one stage of your life. And it's not the way, once you have kids, your biology sort of changes and you begin to reorient around the next generation, and the way you think of yourself, the way you think about pleasure all changes. And this framing will begin to make perfect sense. You're like, oh yeah, that's why you do that. And and again, I'm not saying that necessarily for my kids I'd be against gay marriage, but I would recommend to them, even if they are gay, that they consider that it might be much easier just from a cost perspective to be heterosexually married and masturbate their sexual instincts through literal masturbation. And somebody can be like, well, how dare you tell somebody to not do whatever turns them on whenever it turns them on? And I'm like, well, I mean, you've got to consider that actually a huge chunk of the population is turned on by like hurting people. And I'll add the statistics here, but like, should they do? And they're like, no, of course.
So to put the numbers I'm about to read in context, in a 2021 survey, 3% of the global population identifies as gay, and around 5.5% of the US population identify as LGBT. So, what percent of women are turned on by seeing somebody humiliated? 15%, 20% for men. For women, seeing a person portrayed as disposable, 8% for men. Seeing a person dehumanized, women 11%, men 13%. Seeing a person betrayed, women 11%, men 8%. Seeing somebody be a slave, 16% for women, 22% for men. Seeing a person be consumed by another person or thing, 2% for women, 3% for men. So there you're getting around like global gay rates. Snuff, seeing somebody die, 3% for women, 4% for men. So again, equivalent to global rates of people who identify as gay. Now, just because somebody thinks it's hot when somebody is a slave or dies, does that mean that they should have the right for that to happen? No. For some more numbers here, a female crying, 14% of women, 13% of men. Actually, a little surprised that number's higher for women than men. That's interesting. Causing physical pain, 13% for women, 17% for men. Humiliation, 15% for women, 20% for men. So again, you can see here, just because something turns on a large group of people doesn't mean that we should just go out and do that thing. It doesn't mean that we should have a societal mandate for that thing to be acted upon. Now, if you're the type of individual who doesn't have any of these arousal patterns, and you're looking at these numbers and you're horrified, something I would commit to you from the research that we've gone over today is if you remove the types of pornography that are designed to masturbate these specific pathways, it is very clear in the data that people will find other ways to masturbate these pathways using real human beings. That's why it's so important to not put restrictions on these types of pornography. Now, as a side note here, you might say, well, how dare you compare this to being gay, because being gay doesn't hurt anyone. And it's like, well, being gay doesn't hurt anyone when you're still able to bring your children into existence. But if being gay makes it impossible for you to have kids, denies people who otherwise would have had the chance to live their right to exist, then yeah, it does hurt other people. So I'd say that my relationship with the morality of gay relationships is both tied to the amount of resources those individuals have and the amount of technology that we have access to at any given time period that allows them to still have kids or not have kids. And you might look at this and be like, how could you value somebody who's not born yet? And it reminds me of one of my cousins where she was like, well, if you have fewer kids, if you stop having kids now, your existing kids will get to go on more vacations and do more fun stuff. And I was thinking, I hope she remembers that as she gets to meet the kids who she wished never existed. As they go to family reunions, as they grow up, as they start college, those are human beings that she will form relationships with, and she will realize the genuine harm that she was wishing on somebody she now has a relationship with. This moral framework where we just discount anyone's well-being just because they haven't been born yet, I think is really, really harmful. And if you find this types of data interesting, we go over way, way more in this, The Pragmatist Guide to Sexuality, and it retails for like $1 on Amazon. We don't really make any money on it. All of it goes to our nonprofit, which is working on the school and stuff. The pittance that we do make, it's, just for data nerds, I guess.
And I'm like, well, should they be allowed to like masturbate? And a lot of people are like, oh yeah, of course, like do that through masturbation, right? And it's like, well, like what's the F is the difference here, right? It's how inappropriate is this for society, or how much does this like mess with society? What are your thoughts on this, Simone? The idea of reframing, because if you reframe sexuality around utility rather than pleasure, sex just for pleasure is a bad thing, then you, as a married partner, might actually end up in a dead bedroom scenario less likely. Like someone could be like, wouldn't this cause dead bedrooms? And I'm like, actually, it would lead to dead bedrooms less, because the wife understands that her duty towards sex is not for the pleasure that she may get for it. Even if she finds it unpleasurable, it's for the chemical bonding that it creates between the couple.
Yeah, I mean, you and I may find this just so normalized already because we've already completely separated out of necessity the concept of procreative sex and the concept of like couple bonding sex, because we have to do IVF to have our kids.
Well,
so none of our kids were created
soon. By 2060, 50% of the people in the developed world are going to be infertile. Like,
well, and a lot of couples we know who can absolutely have kids naturally are still choosing to have their kids with IVF, and there's a lot of reasons that people might want to do that, like health related reasons for even just the children. So like, you know, your kids are gonna have better outcomes, sort of health risk wise, if you create them with younger eggs and sperm than with older eggs and sperm. So it makes a lot of sense, even for perfectly.
So if you're like a technophilic family and you want like a really large number of kids,
to
you are
bank your embryos
always
young.
better doing IVF and taking like a year to just do like 5 cycles of IVF and just create tons of embryos and then use those in the future.
Although if you, all the single guys listening to this who may not already have a partner and may not have the ability to create embryos now, freeze your sperm. It is only going to get worse. It's only going to go downhill.
Actually, frozen sperm and eggs don't do very well. It's almost a scam.
Well, no, frozen sperm does better. Think about all the people who've created embryos using sperm donors too.
So the poster child of IVF, it was this woman who was in all the newspapers, and she did an IVF cycle, and she got something like 12 eggs from the cycle, not unusual for an IVF cycle.
Yeah.
And then when she was 40, she decided she wanted to have kids, and none of them worked out.
Well, yeah, women, it's harder. And also, 12 eggs is nothing.
No, you really, if you're a woman, you need to do like 5 or 6 cycles. Like
if you're a woman, but I said all the single guys. I didn't say girls. I said free sperm, not eggs. Oh, sorry. I'm not mad. Oh, I'm not mad.
And by the way, for people out there, you're monsters, biblically speaking, for creating lots of embryos, because the Bible says life begins at conception. It absolutely does not. It says, I knew you before you were in your mother's womb. It says that life begins before conception. And if you lower the number of kids you're having, you're denying people the right to exist that otherwise would have existed based on your choices. I'm just saying, we talk about this all the time, but I'm never going to
anyway, back to the topic though. I really do think that separating these things out, not just when it comes to human sexuality, but almost all aspects of life, makes so much more sense. Like even just do what makes the most sense in whatever context. You know, don't do something because everyone else does it. Do it because it seems right to you. Don't, like, if eating breakfast at like 2 a.m. in the morning is what works for you, do it. And just, it seems really weird to me that one partner is supposed to be just everything to a certain extent to the other for life.
Well, I also think that this rule around, you're allowed to have sex, whether it's premaritally to, like, I don't know, maybe learn how to get better at sex because you think you will be able to secure better partners. That allows for a change in context where you're like, okay, I'm having sex premaritally, but I'm not doing it for pleasure. I'm doing it to improve technique or seduction ability. And that means that when I am doing this, I am focused on those elements, which is actually what I was focused on when I was doing it. I was like, okay, I need to get really good at this to secure a good partner, was one of the things I was always had in the back of my head. But then the second thing is that it makes it so that there's like less loopholes. So like an individual could say, okay, so somebody holds a gun to your head and they say, sleep with this person other than your wife, or I will kill your wife and kids. Well, if you go with the traditional morality, you're like, okay, I can't do that. But if you go with this moral framework where it's like you are allowed to have sex with other people, but only if it's for the best interest of like your family's objective function.
But also think about the number of marriages that are created on really thin and bad ground because they're really created for sex and not for partnership. And if people were to just completely unparse sex from partnership, and I like what you were saying there with regard to sexual orientation as well. What I was actually thinking was there are probably quite a few like straight women who would also love to have kids, who, if they could just find the right partnership with another straight woman, but not make it about sex or marriage or romance, just make it about kid raising partnership, could just do a great job. Like that,
we will have another video on single parenthoods, gay parenthoods, going over all the statistics. I just haven't collected all the data yet.
Oh, okay. No, we should definitely do that. But yeah, I just feel like we could piece together so many really optimal situations that are customized to people's unique circumstances if we just decoupled some things. And to a certain extent, I'm really against these days the concept of atomization, you know, the fact that to a great extent, modernity and progressive culture and the government and bureaucracies have atomized the human and separated them out from their support networks, separated them out from their communities and their religions and everything. I think that's bad. But I also really do love piecing together life on an a la carte basis and not doing stuff just because, we always have to do this together and we always have to do that together. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see this in our relationship. I mean, we sleep in different rooms of the house, right? Like,
Yeah,
it's
because
like
it
I
makes the
wake
most
up at
sense.
2 a.m. and you wake up at 5 a.m. and I don't want to interrupt your sleep schedule, right? So,
Well,
like,
and for example, like when we go on vacation, we don't actually eat out at restaurants. We save that for home because one, the prices are lower, and then we enjoy restaurants more while we're at home. Whereas on vacation, we're already out. We're already staying for a place we paid for that is nice. Like, why would we?
yeah, we go to
waste
the local
additional
grocery
money?
store, which is different, and we eat there. So it's about separating things out in a way that makes sense instead of parrying them thematically the way that we are taught to as a society. And I would go so far as to say that I would actually be okay. So people know that I think that one day when we have the genetic technology, we should maybe remove human arousal patterns. If it turns out we can build a stable society where people learn to only indulge in their arousal patterns around things that have no negative externalities, then I would be okay with humans keeping their arousal patterns. I'd say, yeah, that's fine. We found a social technology that allows that. But when I look today at the groups that are supposed to be suppressing all this, like the Amish, for example, and we see this horrible grape epidemic, or the Catholic preachers, and we see this big problem with lots and lots of situations that probably shouldn't be situationing and doesn't look good for anyone involved. I mean, if we just said, okay, preachers are allowed pornography, the number of children who have to go through this would be decreased by so much. Those are human beings every year who are being spared this, that have to deal with this because we are dealing with medieval interpretations of the Bible that just don't necessarily work for our current time.
I'm just trying to say that if we don't change, then we might lose everyone to atheism.
What exactly do you suggest we change?
Well, for one, no sex with boys.
The holy document of law states that a priest cannot get married, so where are we to get our sex?
Okay, maybe we just need to forget about the Gilgamesh for a second and focus.
Forget about the Gilgamesh!
I'm just saying, what works on planet Gilgamesh isn't necessarily going to work for the rest of us here on Earth. You see? That's the problem we're having here.
And I want to say also how beautiful this is. The Bible was written in a way that its interpretation was the most ethical, behavioral set of rules for every era. During the medieval era, it really was good to not be lusting after women other than your wife. But in a modern era where, you have AI and drawn stuff and everything like that, well, it's not against the rules and it's not against the rules biblically. So the Bible can be interpreted two ways for two different technological contexts. And isn't it a miracle that it was written in a way where it could be interpreted these two ways? It's almost supernatural. But it was written in that way. Anyway, I love you to death, Simone. Any final thoughts?
Just that I love you.
Any interpretations about this interpretation?
No, honestly, no. It just makes so much more sense and leads to so much less sin that I think in the end, when in doubt and interpreting scripture or general concepts, you look at the consequences. If one interpretation leads to more corruption, more harm, and more sin, it's the wrong interpretation.
The Bible says this best: by their fruits you will know them. How do you know the correct interpretation? It works. If it leads to mass child rape and cover-ups, it's not the correct interpretation. The Bible tells us that. Easy peasy. Right, guys? I love you, Simone.
I love you too. Okay, I'm going to run down.
But the most important thing, and Octavian, you can come join us here, it removes the possibility that you might end up marrying someone because of how hot you thought they were. And so when you're thinking about marrying them, all you're thinking about is, are they going to make good kids? You're not saying like and subscribe. You're not saying like and subscribe. You're not saying like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.